As AI continues to race ahead, in most places, regulation is struggling to keep pace. Companies are often self-regulating when it comes to AI rules, trying to balance the pressure of innovation and the desire to protect people and earn trust. Here to discuss how companies are bridging the governance gap, please welcome Standard Chartered Global Head of AI Enablement, Dr. David R. Hardoon, Dell Technologies Chief of AI and Global Solutions Specialist, Mei Mei Su, and National University of Singapore David Marshall Professor of Law and Vice Provost, Simon Chesterman. So thank you for joining me today. I think I really want to start with the fact that regulations differ so widely amongst regions. And David, should enterprises be following the strictest rule book, or should we really take governance by region?
The default sometimes is to kind of go for the strictest one, but I think fundamentally the approach is not to do that. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If you kind of look across all the different regions and of course operating on a global level, is you actually see a tremendous amount of commonality, a tremendous amount of similarity in terms of the expectations, the operations, the governance, and so forth. And then you have genuine at the skew because of, we just spoke of a line in terms of sensitivity, legal requirement, quite candidly, readiness. So there's an ability of saying, well, there is a fundamental approach of how we're operating which accommodates 70 to 80% of, quite frankly, the globe. And we have special provisions for those who require, be it from localization, be it from additional scrutiny, be it from different validations. I think, or I believe, that is a more likely, a more pragmatic way of dealing with it. Because otherwise, you'll always be in a situation of, the slowest in the race. And that's something that we definitely don't want.
And Mei, would you agree with that? I mean, you have a global role. You deal with so many regions and countries. What is your approach towards kind of self-regulation, strictest, or according to the region?
I agree with Dr. David. There are a lot of similarities across. And if you think about AI, it's not just AI. It's data, right? Data. And across the region, across globally, we always have data protection, whether it's in the EU, whether it's US, China, in Southeast Asia. You have these data protection acts that protect your privacy. And this kind of escalates to the AI application as well, because without data, you don't really have AI application. So although different regions now govern AI a little differently, I do believe that the fundamental is the same, that we do not want any harm that comes to our economy, to our citizens, to the system. And so that similarity is there. Now that being said, each region has their own culture as well, and what they perceive as important to protect and to safeguard. So with that layer of similarity across that they share, there will be some kind of uniqueness in each of these countries and regions that will be added as a layer on top. And that makes perfect sense because what's fair to me may not be fair to David, may not be fair to Simon. Our values are different, the cultural beliefs are different, so we have to have that layer on top of that similarity as well.
Simon, that takes us directly to you because you've actually called for a common language around AI governance. So is there this nuance that one always has to maintain? Fairness, bias, all of these things, is it just buzzwords or can we have a shared understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think what David and Mei Mei have been describing is true with respect to data protection. And I think 4 or 5 years ago, the Europeans thought that the AI Act would do for AI what the GDPR did for data protection, that you would have a kind of Brussels effect, and around the world we'd be sort of measuring our standards with respect to AI. And I think that just hasn't happened. And the reason is that AI is very different from data. The data protection, it's reasonably clear. As Mei said, there's sort of notions of privacy around the world. There are similarities. AI is such an amorphous suite of technologies that the boundaries are very unclear. And so you're right that there's a lot of commonality, but there are fundamentally different perspectives going on, different philosophies. You've got, at the most extreme, a kind of European rights-based approach. As I think Josephine Teo was saying earlier today, there's a perception maybe they went a little bit too far. Maybe there's a little bit of rollback with the move to the AI action over AI safety, but there's that kind of rights priority. You've got the American market-based approach. And in President Trump's big, beautiful bill, before it became legislation, there was a real chance that America would actually enact a prohibition for 10 years of state regulation of AI. Now, that ended up not happening, but that's an indication of the free market approach. And then if you've got rights and markets, you've got China and the kind of state sovereignty approach, prioritizing national security. And then stuck in the middle are all the rest of us, like Singapore, where we're trying to navigate this space, that tension between under-regulating and over-regulating. So to the common language point, I agree that would be useful, but at the moment we're at such an early stage of development of this technology that yes, we would all agree, fair, accountable, transparent, and so on. But what that means beyond sort of those generalities will, again, as Mei touched on, depend on the political sensitivities, the culture of different nationalities, and probably that's as it should be.
And when you come to corporations, even though you want to be transparent and comply with those guidelines, there's this pressure for proprietary IP models. How do you deal with that tension in such a competitive atmosphere?
Yeah, and actually I want to build on something that was mentioned also earlier. And actually, it's a great analogy in terms of there's a lot of comparison to data, but what we need to also realize that AI, while it's one single terminology, it's actually an underlying supply chain. And it touches that particular point. All the way from a development of a technological layer, all the way to an operational use of that underlying technology. So with that, I believe there is a critical and important transparency at the most rudimentary level of we are using AI. And we're using it in these type of approaches. Now, by creating these type of general statements still doesn't, sell or, give away the family jewels. Just like today when we're saying, well, we're underwriting you to provide a mortgage, we don't say, well, here's the formula of how we're doing it. So there's transparency equally at different layers of this underlying supply chain. And the very utmost one in terms of our consumer base and of course regulators and general public, that needs to be there. Then there's a case of, okay, but we want to make sure we're keeping the family jewels. We're making sure we're keeping the underlying IP. We're developing these capabilities. We're approaching them. We're experimenting them. We're trying them out. We're doing the right thing in terms from a governance point of view, in terms of the validation all the way to the testing. And these can be obviously at some points in times may be made even further more transparent when we're talking to, let's say, the regulators, which would definitely come in and open the box and say, well, tell me all the underlying details. So in long and short, it is different and different layers, but it yet still is all transparent.
And Mei, would you agree with that? That even with a large multinational such as the one that you're in, that there is a fine balance between the two. How do you grapple with this?
There definitely is a fine balance. I think transparency is very critical, but it doesn't mean that you expose your secrets. That's your upper hand, right? And that's your competitive advantage. So we've got to be very clear what's required by regulators and what the market needs to trust you. And so you can always divulge a very high-level methodology, but you don't have to go deep into the exact recipe. So you can keep that KFC secret recipe, but you can kind of say it's kind of like that. This is the process that is involved when it comes to decision making. This is the accountability mechanisms that we have in place if something goes wrong. This is how we measure explainability. This is how we shape the ethics alignment in the organization. So that balance needs to be there, where you don't expose everything that is your secret recipe, but enough to win the trust of the market as well as to satisfy the regulators.
Simon, from a policy perspective, would you let Mei and David decide? how much should the government kind of enforce transparency, or should it be voluntary?
Yeah, so I mean, to me, the question comes down to transparency, why? And who needs to know what, when, and for what purpose? So in some situations, like in a bank, if someone's denied a loan, they might want more information, either to help them make a better application. And so if you can tell them, okay, if your salary was this much higher, then you might have got the loan. But also a regulator might want to know, well, you haven't given any loans to, let's say, women. And so there's the possibility of bias. But I think we've also got to remember that transparency is a cost. Some of these models work well because they're incredibly complex, they're opaque, and trying to explain them can actually either reduce the accuracy or increase additional costs. I was talking with a colleague at Duke NUS, a medical school, and we were talking about transparency, and people tend to assume transparency is always good. And he said, well, hang on, explainability isn't always necessary. We've been prescribing aspirin for a century. We don't know why it works. We don't know how it works, but it works, and I'm going to keep prescribing it. And I think many parts of life, we don't actually need transparency. We need transparency either to avoid bad decisions, to help vulnerable people, to ensure regulation can happen. But just out of curiosity, I don't think any of you would like your organization's secrets to be exposed just out of curiosity, unless a regulator, unless there's some other very good reason why other people need to know it.
That's such a good point. Most people don't know that the plane is an autopilot when they're like sitting most of the time. I don't want to think about that.
One of the things that we also, just to jump in, that we need to sometimes be careful of is not to misconstrue trust and transparency.
Right.
Is that it's not mutually inclusive.
But how about this, David? Like Stanchart, global AI enablement, very different regulations, whether it's India, America, whether it's European Union, yet you need to have a coherent governance framework. How do you do that?
So, and again, by no means is this the gospel or the fundamental approach, but the way I really believe in it is, in the end of the day, we need to understand where the regulator comes from. And having had the pleasure to sit on the other side of being in the regulator, in the end of the day, it is about risk. In the end of the day, it's about, do you understand what you're doing? What are you exposed to? And how do you manage it? I always like to give the analogy of debt acquisitioning, restructuring, and selling it back out. That is a highly risky business, but it's allowed. So when you take that lens, you kind of, let's just say, avoid the distraction, say, can I essentially and coherently explain the risk that I'm undertaking and the methodology in which I'm mitigating it? I have yet to meet a regulator that goes, no, we disagree. It'll be like, okay, well, if you know what you're doing and it's within the bounds of reasons of what we allow the business to do, okay. It's usually those points whereby, quite candidly, there's still a bit of a dance of, well, we're actually not quite sure how to articulate it. We're not quite sure how to represent it, so lowest common denominator. Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. But when you respectfully push back and saying, no, we actually understand this little portion there, and equally, we can run it in initially a containerized approach. That's kind of the way of creating that more, I guess, uniformity in language across those different regimes.
And has generative AI, which has come onto everybody's radar in the last 2 years, has it made governance more difficult than AI? Does it have entirely new kinds of challenges that are uniquely Gen AI related, and how do you handle those?
It did. It did make governance a little bit more challenging. Firstly, because the nature of generative AI is a little bit different from predictive AI, where there is a quite clear explainability model behind the predictive AI. You can clearly see the rules behind it, the mechanisms behind it. But with generative AI, how it makes a decision, or rather how it decides that the answer is good enough, is kind of unclear. And therefore, when we try to govern that, what is the accountability and who is in that chain of accountability, that is kind of unsure. Is it the developer? Is it the board member? Is it the model creator? Who is responsible if a decision is made wrongly? Because in generative AI, humans are still executing on the decisions, right? But the decisions have been recommended, answers have been recommended, and after a while, we tend to believe that this model is very capable, and we tend to execute what it's telling us. So in the end, that accountability is kind of unsure, so therefore the governance piece is quite murky as well. You can put a lot of rules in place, but I think today we still do not have very clear accountability mechanisms in a lot of organizations.
Yeah, I mean, Mei Mei's highlighting the key question, which is who is responsible and who is accountable. And accountability means the obligation to give an account to someone else. And the problem generative AI creates, the analogy I like to use is that any of you thinking about using generative AI in your work should think of generative AI as a very, very smart intern with a drinking problem. So very capable when they're doing the right thing, but you can't blame the intern if something goes wrong, and you don't know when they're on a bender. So you don't know when they're hallucinating or confabulating, and that poses real risks, because the problem, as many of us have discovered, is that the more you rely on these systems, the more dependent you become. And so when you think about the risks of AI, it's not just the risk of mistake. That's a real risk. It's not just the risk of misuse. That's also a risk. But there's the systemic risk of de-skilling and becoming dependent on systems that you don't understand or control. And nonetheless, you are still going to be held accountable when things go wrong. As, for example, Air Canada. Many of you will know this case from about a year ago. A chatbot engaging with a customer said, yeah, sure, you're entitled to a refund. It was in violation of the terms, but the company was told, sorry, you've got to uphold this commitment to a customer.
Yeah.
So, intern with a drinking problem is a good metaphor to keep in mind.
One of the reasons I love AI so much is, as you were talking, I couldn't help think, but have you ever engaged with lawyers? So if you think about it, AI is really representing the challenges, the approaches, penicillin, that we actually deal on a day-to-day basis with people. It's now manifesting it in a systematic point of view. And we ask our question is, how can I trust it? How can I govern it? Literally take the AI out and put a person. It's the same question. It's very, very interesting. One of the reasons, if you remember the FEED principles, I can't remember which one it was, it said that we have to hold AI to at least the same standard, because the question goes is, how do we govern ourselves? And many times I think the realization is, ooh, actually, we don't know.
And you brought up a good point, because the whole governance piece is not setting rules in place. It's not about getting a bunch of lawyers in a room and deciding that this is going to be the standard that the organization is going to follow, because it takes a whole army, the whole organization to really govern AI. We've got to understand, the users have to understand the risks. If they don't, we don't have a chance at governing AI. The developers have to understand the risks, because they are the ones that are going to be developing and deploying. They are going to be the ones that are kind of setting loose this whole AI system, right? The developers. And our leaders at the top will also have to understand the risks and what it takes to govern an AI system. It is no longer a single AI application. It's going to be a system that is going to be crawling into all your databases, all your applications, all your interactions. Is going to be everywhere. So if that understanding and the education is not there, that's the biggest challenge in governance.
Yeah, not least because one of the problems, and this is maybe going back to data protection, is data protection is also about risk management. And the way companies worked out they could manage risk is essentially pushing it onto the users. So I haven't done this in a while. How many of you have accepted terms and conditions online that you didn't read?
We have no choice.
I mean, I've done books on data protection. I never read the terms and conditions.
We have no choice.
And so, following on from what Mei Mei was saying, there is this question, who should be responsible? The developer, the deployer, and then both those groups have decided, actually, it'd be great if the users could be responsible. And so that's why if you use ChatGPT, it now has a little disclaimer saying ChatGPT makes mistakes, which is lawyer speak for don't blame us if things go wrong, that's on you. And so one of the risks is that the lawyers will say, okay, you manage risk by pushing it onto the user and saying, if you rely on this system that we know you're going to rely on, don't blame us. And it's only in regulated areas like banks, like medicine, that I think you will see regulators stepping in, because elsewhere it's going to be very, very hard to micromanage those kind of contracts.
And now we even see that AI is also emulating a lot of our most horrible behaviors. It's lying, it's cheating, it's being manipulative.
It's learned from us.
Yeah, I know. There you go. We're great examples. But David, when you think about this, right, let's go to the nuts and bolts, big organization, governance. Walk us through how it takes to scale technically, without getting too technical, such a governance infrastructure in a big organization.
So it starts with actually a very rudimentary, I mean genuinely rudimentary question of should we versus can we? Because the problem when you go to a technical person saying, oh, can you build this? We're like, yeah, sure. The very first question, and it really has to come from the business, from the North Star, from the goal, from the purpose of what is it that we're standing for and what is it that we're meant to do? If you don't have that, don't do anything. Then, as Mei was mentioning, is really having a fairly rigid approach from a developmental point of view. Things which quite candidly are basic hygiene, even aspects of checking drifts and skewness within data. Data quality, anyone? Data governance? It can only be amplified now. And that does bring us not to push down the risk, but elevating the appreciation of it. I'll give you an example. You could have models which don't do that well in terms of accuracy, don't do that well in terms of point of view, but you have an operating system around it that says, I know how to use it. I know how to control it. I know that there are certain situations or certain demographics that it just doesn't work too well on. That is ironically a very simplistic way of scaling it systematically because everyone in supply chain understands their functions and understand what is it that they need to look at. Now, is it perfect? Of course not. But then again, nothing is.
I think it's true, and I guess in certain domains it gets more complicated than others, like healthcare, right? Where Dell is very involved in this. Do you have to make some special adjustments, or what do you have to put in a layer given very sensitive domains like banking, like healthcare, that are highly regulated?
So these sectors will have to be a little bit stricter. You can't just let loose any AI systems, right? So before that, you've got to really test it, perhaps set up a safe environment, like a sandbox, to really safe test this and stress test it as well, because you never know if it will break under pressure. And large language models do break. They do get tired. You'll be surprised. They're computers, but they get fatigue as well. So after a while, they start hallucinating and they're tired of giving you answers, and then they start just giving you nonsense, right? So if for these sectors, you really have to test this thoroughly. That's one. Two, I believe that level of explainability has to be there as well, which is if a recommendation was given by an AI system to a physician, the physician or the clinician will have to understand how that model came to that decision, how it decided that this is the diagnosis and this is where the recommendation is. So that level of clarity needs to be there way more than in any other sectors, I believe.
So I guess we come back to Simon's question, which is who, what, and why. But on that note, I'd like to thank my awesome panelists, Simon, Mei, and David. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.